Now we're going to have a look at the structural change which arises when black exchanges on d4, white recaptures with the c-pawn, and black plays d5, thus gaining an element of stability in the center. This was used in one of the most important games of last year between Caruana and Kramnik, and Caruana's victory in this game ultimately led to him, after the final round, being able to claim victory in Dortmund on tiebreak. So Kramnik selected the Berlin, and Caruana avoided the endgame with d3, bishop c5, castles, d6, c3, castles, knight bd2, and knight e7. And now, as Caruana notes, the only critical move here is d4, because if white waits, for instance, with say h3, then after knight g6, black will have defended this pawn in time and will be in a position to meet d4 with bishop b6 holding the center. So playing d4 immediately, because the pawn is hanging, means that black has to take on d4 and then play bishop b6. But the good news from black's perspective is that the white pieces aren't so well placed to defend this center yet, and black can play a quick d5. So Caruana played simply b3, preparing to bring his bishop into the game, b2, d5, e5, and knight e4. And now we have this typical central configuration where black has an outpost on e4, or effectively an outpost on e4, a very strong square on e4, and the question is really whether that is sufficient to balance white's central space advantage. So for the next few moves, Caruana battles against this knight on e4, trying to force a trade, knight c6 and bishop b2. And now Kramnik takes and replaces the knight with the bishop. So again, just as for the past few moves, taking on e4 is never really a runner for white, because after d takes e4, there are immediate tactical problems with the d pawn. And in fact, if this knight were to move as it should, then problems with the e pawn as well, in view of this tactical threat. So, but Caruana played quite ambitiously with bishop e2. He notes that a continuation like queen e3, continuing to try to force black to trade pieces, would lead to approximate equality after these exchanges. Yeah, with a position which looks pretty level. Bishop e2 keeps some more complexity in the position, and Kramnik consistently seeks to undermine the white center with f6. b4 is a very strong move from Caruana, so a couple of ideas in mind. Firstly, he wants to restrict the black bishop from moving to a5, where it could harass the white queen. But secondly, it's a move which fights for the center in a very direct way, because white now has ideas of b5, such as that used in the game. And Kramnik took on d5, and here made a mistake with king h8. Caruana notes that I think he was expecting the prophylactic move h6. You can see, given the use which white makes of the g5 square in the game, how it would be useful to cover that square. And he also notes that even d4 is a possibility with play which he describes as complex. So if Caruana views it as too complex to assess, I'm certainly not going to try. But in any event, either of those moves was preferable to king h8, because now after b5, knight e7, knight g5, black's position is under some tactical pressure, because after knight g6, Caruana played the very calm move g3. A move like knight e6 leads to a position where white, I suppose, should be somewhat frightened by black's kingside attack, and indeed, if you check this position with the computer, it turns out that black is just winning in this position. But g3 is a lot more restrained, and now knight e6 is a real threat. So Kramnik went queen e7, e6, rook f5, just forcing this knight to declare its intentions, and now takes, queen d7 in order to trade queens, and suddenly we have a position where the white e-pawn has managed to become kind of the star performer, and supported by the bishop pair. It's very, very strong. Black still has some hopes for counterplay based on the weak pawn on f2, which is fixed by this pawn on e4. And indeed, Kramnik manages to use that to some effect, although it turns out that his idea has practical rather than objective merit. After rook f8, white took on e7 and bishop a3. Now this knight is attacked. And it doesn't really seem that black's tactical ideas are working. For instance, after rook takes f2, I would think that white could take that. Bishop takes f2 check is going to lead to a position after king g2 where, although black isn't immediately dropping material because he has this tactical trick, it's still a position where I think the e-pawn is going to be very difficult to stop. And rook takes f2, I would have thought is similar. After bishop takes e7, or even perhaps king h1. But certainly Kramnik saw fit to defend this knight rather than seek to prosecute his attack through f2, and simply played rook e8. And now after rook d1 played h5 to seek to control the g4 square. But after rook d7, it turns out that black's defense of this e7 square is quite flimsy, and white has a number of tactical opportunities associated with having a far advanced pass pawn, much like Kramnik used to have, or still does have in many positions, with a passed d pawn, which he gets against the Grunfeld quite regularly. Here black is struggling to hold the blockade. After knight d5, rook f7, knight f6, this knight has now found a stable square, but it's not standing directly in front of the pawn anymore. Bishop c4 simply protecting the pawn, bishop c5, bishop b2. White avoids the trade, except now offers it tactically. So yeah, clearly to take on d4 would drop the exchange on e7, and taking here isn't really an option either when black still can't take on d4. So after bishop d4, black played bishop d6. But now rook e1, e6, check, king h7, and rook takes e4, which ought to have been effectively the end of the game. But after rook takes f2, Caruana made a mistake by taking on f2 himself. Instead, he gives rook e1 as winning, in view of rook d2, bishop e3, bishop c5, exchange on c5 and rook f7 when the e pawn can't be stopped. Instead, after king takes f2, Kramnik ought to have been safe, but he made a mistake here after rook a8, which was to take on e6 immediately, which is quite uncharacteristic. Ordinarily, you would expect Kramnik to find king g6 when, in order to avoid the loss of c-pawn, white has to take on c5. And after bishop takes c5, rook takes a7, king f6, rook a8 and g6. Caruana assesses the position as drawn, notwithstanding his extra pawn in view of the opposite colour bishops. Instead, knight takes e6 allowed white to generate decisive threats against the black king. So this very nice move h4, simply controlling the g5 square, g6 and out check, and rook g8. And the threat to the g7 or the g6 pawn, coupled with ideas of bishop e3 check, force rook g7. But this is not playable. So after a couple of accurate regrouping moves, it turns out that black actually struggles to avoid zugzwang here, because if the knight moves, the rook can come into e6, and if the king moves, king g5 is possible. So after rook e5, knight h5, rook e6, black resigned here. So, like I say, one of the most important games from last year, which took place in quite an original position. But both players showed great consistency, I think, in handling this pawn structure, which arises when black takes on d4 and plays d5. But ultimately, I think Caruana just proved slightly stronger and better prepared for the ensuing structure than Kramnik in this particular game.